This section will look at the residential school experience and how it shaped a generation of people through its impact on individuals and communities. Even though Aboriginal women today carry the heaviest burden of the impact, it is important to acknowledge that both men and women experienced abuse and violence in the residential school system. In the mid-19th century, the Canadian government started the residential school program for Aboriginal children as a means of assimilating them into mainstream Canadian society. The number of residential schools reached its peak in 1931, with 80 schools operating across Canada. The residential school experience is a major contributing factor to intergenerational violence and abuse in Aboriginal communities, which continues to this day.
I never understood what residential school was. I'd heard the word residential school mostly come from my mother's words. I always knew my mother went to residential school. What it meant that she went there, I didn't understand. I never really heard my father talk about school as I grew up. My father had used the tools that he had learned to bring his children up. And as I got older, my father and I continued to have problems in our relationship with communicating and getting along.
Having grown up in the bush, we had to learn how to respect everything around us. And as a child, we learned it was just a behavior we learned. To not pour hot water on the grass, for instance, to light a fire in the bush on top of rocks, then how to put out that fire, how to cook while we're in the bush, and how to treat the animals, the birds, the plant life, our vegetation, our sustenance. And so we learned that respect, and then growing up in an extended family, we just respected the siblings, the youngsters, the next generation, and the older generation.
In 1884, the Canadian government decided that Aboriginal peoples needed to leave their traditions behind. For example, the government decided that they should not participate in traditional ceremonies and made it illegal to do so. Also, the federal government made it mandatory for every Indian child to be sent to residential schools upon reaching 7 years of age. They thought that this would help to civilize them. By 1933, residential school principals were made the legal guardians of all Native students, and parents were forced by law to surrender legal custody of their children or face imprisonment.
My two brothers were in residential school. My parents took them out of the residential school, and after my parents were hounded by the missionaries, the game warden, the police, and the Indian agents. And my parents lost their Indian status after they took my brothers out of the Indian residential school.
The schools were designed to Christianize and to educate Indian children in Western ways, and in doing so, to prepare them for life in mainstream Canadian society. The ultimate goal was that of cultural assimilation.
My mother went to Lejac residential school, and all of her siblings, and she had 10 other siblings. And my father also went to Lejac residential school. I went to Lejac in around 1960. I went there for about 3 years. I think that it would be hard for a child to learn anything in a place like Lejac.
The Indian residential schools employed the boarding school model, removing children from their homes and placing them in church-run schools during the school year. By doing so, the ties between children and their parents, extended families, communities, and cultures were severed.
The violence comes from, first of all, separating, taking children away from families. And it was really quite a traumatic experience. It was traumatic for the children being taken away, and for the parents. I've talked to different elders who said that the communities were just so quiet after the children left, and that people were in so much grief that they didn't know what to do. So a lot of times what happened is they began to drink to deal with their sorrow.
Children were separated from everything and everyone they knew, including siblings, even though they may have been at the same school. Students were forbidden to speak their native language and to practice any of the traditional customs.
The use of the Aboriginal language was totally forbidden. We were punished quite severely for speaking our language.
One of the first things I remember is being taught English so that I could go to Lejac. And my first language is Second A, and I didn't speak English until I was 4 years old.
In the past century, many of Canada's once flourishing Aboriginal languages have become extinct or are now on the brink of extinction.
The most significant part of a culture is the language. You know, a language, words and meaning really speaks to the heart and soul of the people. They have ways of experiencing things, communicating things that goes to their very core of existence. When that's taken away, and when people are punished and shamed into not being able to express themselves in the way that they should, and the beauty of it all, it takes away the pride, and it takes away who they are.
I was fortunate because when I left residential school for the summer, the 2 months in the summer, because my parents were alcoholics and were not able to care for me, I would spend the time with my grandmother, and she didn't speak any English. So I went from 10 months of speaking no Ktunaxa to 2 months of speaking total Ktunaxa. So I was able to retain my language that way. And many of the people of my generation that had grandparents are in the same situation. That's how we were able to retain the language.
Despite the fact that residential schools were federally mandated, they were inadequately funded. This made for poorly constructed schools, sanitary and ventilation problems, inadequate diet, clothing, and medical care. According to the medical inspector from the Department of Indian Affairs in 1907, between 25% and 50% of the children that entered Western residential schools died during their first year.
One of the memories that I have of Lejac when I first went is very few, and I remember only negative instances. One is when it was Halloween, I think, and we were being chased. And when we were caught, they had put some sort of dry soap in our mouth. And so that's what I remember from there. And also being strapped, having to kneel on the floor for a long time. And it was always something that was really negative. I don't remember being in a classroom, and I don't remember like books or anything like that. When you're in a place like LeJac, when you're sick, you're just in bed by yourself. And I remember being sick and just laying there, just wishing my mom was there. And I know that other girls in the dormitory, when they were there in the dormitory, a lot of times there'd be a lot of crying at nights, just from people who are girls who really miss their family.
Many communities today have roots built from damaged families as a result of the generations of children who were taken out of their homes and separated from their families. For over 100 years, Aboriginal peoples were brought up by institutions, not knowing what a healthy family life is like. When they became parents themselves, many passed a history of violence and neglect onto their children. They then had no choice but to send their children to a residential school where they themselves were abused.
It's like we didn't learn how to be with our families. We didn't know what that was all about.
When I left the residential school at the age of 15, I returned home to a situation where my parents were both alcoholics, and they were drinking when I returned home. But the next day, when my mother realized that I had returned home at the age of 15, that I'd been sent home, it made a big impact on her life, and from that day forward, she never had another drink. She realized that she needed to provide for me, and that's what changed her life around.
I believe that my mother was shut down most of her life, and she was 69 when she passed away, and I don't think that she ever really healed from what happened to her as a child. She was never really a mother to me. I was her mother, and it was only because she had suffered so much pain when she was a child.
I always told people that my mother went to residential school because my father said he went to Catholic school. And one day when I was explaining to an elder some issues that my father and I were having, he had said to me, just keep in mind that our people went to residential school, and the effects of what they had gone through is what we're experiencing today. And I had said, my father didn't go to residential school. And he said, yes, he did. And I said, he went to Catholic school. And he said, what do you think residential school was? And it was then that I realized he was in denial of being in residential school, and everything else made so much sense after he had said those words to me on why my father spoke the way he did and why everything was so black and white to him.
I was never in residential school, although some of my brothers and sisters were. My mom was there, and what effect did it have on me? It had a lot of effect on me. One of those effects was my mom's lack of knowledge on how to raise a child, how to discipline a child. Everything was over exaggerated. The discipline was pretty brutal at times. It affected me, post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff like that. You begin to see it as you get older, and my background is exactly the same pattern as 90% of those inmates that I work with. You quit school early, you don't have the education, you get into the drugs and the alcohol as a means of coping with all this abuse that you've suffered, which eventually leads to crime, to jail, and there you go. The cycle is there.
By the 1950s, it became obvious that the residential school program had failed to reach its goals. Aboriginal peoples had not been assimilated into the Canadian mainstream, and graduates were not succeeding in their vocations. Gradually, there was a shift in federal policy, and the control of the residential schools was shifted to the Indian bands, and the last federally funded residential school finally closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. While this tragic chapter in Canadian history is now closed, the legacy of residential schools lives on today. The next video examines the impact that residential schools continue to have on individuals and communities today.